There are moments in life that no camera catches. No reporter writes about them. No headline announces them. They happen in the spaces between the grand ceremonies and the formal speeches, in a quiet hallway, at the edge of a garden, in the pause between one duty and the next. And sometimes the only witness is a person standing very still, doing their job, trained to see everything and say nothing. This is one of those stories. It did not make the front page. It was not meant to. But the man who saw it has never forgotten it. And once you hear what he witnessed between two of the most remarkable women in the British royal family, you will understand exactly why. His name is James. That is what we will call him here, because men who serve in the King's Guard do not seek attention. They do not give interviews. They do not post on social media or speak to tabloids for money. They stand. They watch. They protect. And then when their shift ends, they go home carrying things inside them that most people never get to know. James carried this particular memory for years before he ever spoke about it. And even then, he only shared it quietly, in private, the way you share something that feels almost too personal to say out loud. He described it as one of the most unexpectedly moving things he had ever seen in his years of royal service. And James had seen a great deal. He had joined the household division in his early 20s, full of discipline and pride. He had stood outside Buckingham Palace in the rain and the heat and the bitter cold of British winter. He had guarded corridors during state banquets while world leaders walked past him speaking in hushed tones. He had been present during moments of national celebration and national grief. He had learned, over time, to make himself invisible. Not literally, of course, but in a way that only the most skilled royal staff understand. You become part of the background. You become a fixture, like the portraits on the wall or the polished silver on the table. People forget you are there, and that is exactly the point. It was on one of those unremarkable days, a Tuesday afternoon in autumn, the kind of day that carries a faint chill in the air and the smell of wet leaves, that James was posted inside one of the lesser-used corridors of a royal residence. The main event of the day was already over. A formal engagement had concluded, guests had departed, and the building had settled into that particular kind of quiet that follows the end of something official. Staff moved around him in efficient silence. Doors opened and closed in the distance. And James stood where he was told to stand, watching the corridor, waiting for nothing in particular. He heard them before he saw them. Not loud voices. Never loud voices with these two women. It was more like the soft echo of footsteps coming from two different directions, converging somewhere ahead. And then Princess appeared at one end of the corridor, walking with that unmistakable posture of hers, straight back, firm stride, the kind of walk that has covered 10,000 royal engagements without ever once looking tired. She was dressed simply for the remainder of the day, the formal elements of her earlier appearance set aside. She looked, James would later say, like a woman who had earned every single one of her years. From the other direction came Catherine. At this point in time, she was already a deeply respected figure, not just as a royal consort, but as someone who had grown visibly, publicly, into the responsibilities placed upon her. She too had finished her formal duties for the day. She was walking without the performance of it, without the wave and the careful smile held for cameras. She was just walking. And that, James said, was the first thing that struck him. Both of these women, in the same moment, had forgotten, or perhaps simply set aside, the version of themselves the world usually saw. They noticed each other at almost exactly the same moment. There was a brief pause, the kind that passes between two people who know each other well enough that they do not need to fill every silence with words, and gave a small nod. Catherine smiled, and it was not the polished smile of a public engagement. It was something quieter and more real than that. James, standing at his post, felt suddenly very aware of the fact that he was witnessing something that had nothing to do with protocol. They came together in the middle of the corridor and stopped walking. James kept his gaze forward, as he was trained to do, but his awareness of what was happening beside him was total. He could hear them clearly. The corridor carried sound in a particular way. The old stone walls, and high ceilings made even soft conversations audible to anyone standing close enough. He did not intend to listen, but there was no way not to, and spoke first. She asked, simply and directly, how Catherine was feeling. Not in the way that people ask that question at parties, expecting the word fine in return. She asked it the way an older woman asks a younger one when she genuinely wants to know, with a kind of bluntness that only comes from caring enough to skip the pleasantries. James said he was surprised by the directness of it. Princessin is known for many things, but she is not widely known for softness. Yet there was something unmistakably tender in the way she posed that question. Catherine answered honestly. She spoke about tiredness, not physical tiredness, though that was part of it, but the particular exhaustion that comes from carrying a role as large as hers with the concentration and care she gives to it. She said something about the weight of always wanting to get things right, about the fear, which never fully goes away, of falling short. She did not say it with self-pity. She said it with the matter-of-fact honesty of someone who has accepted this as part of the life she has chosen. But the honesty itself was remarkable, James thought. This was not a conversation for public ears. This was real, and listened without interrupting. That, James would later say, was its own kind of gift, because Princessin does not strike most people as a natural listener. She is quick. She is decisive. She moves fast and speaks plainly and does not generally linger. But in that corridor, she stood completely still and let Catherine speak. And when Catherine had finished, and was quiet for a moment before she responded, "What?" and said, next was something James has turned over in his mind many times since. She told Catherine, and again in that plain, direct way of hers, that the fear of falling short is not a weakness. It is, she said, the thing that keeps you honest. It is the thing that makes you better. She said that every woman who had ever stood in a position like Catherine's had felt it. She said she had felt it herself, more times than she could count. And she said that the fact that Catherine still felt it after everything, after all the years and all the engagements and all the scrutiny, was not something to be ashamed of. It was something to be respected. James said that the air in the corridor changed after and said that. It is a strange thing to describe, the atmosphere of a moment, but he felt it. Something that had been slightly tense in Catherine's posture eased. She exhaled very softly, and then she laughed, a small, genuine laugh that had nothing performative about it at all. She said something like, "I wasn't expecting that from you," and without missing a beat, said something along the lines of, "Good. I'd hate to become predictable." They both laughed then, together in that old corridor with the autumn afternoon light coming through the high windows and no one else watching but a guard who was doing his best to be invisible. It was such a small moment. It lasted perhaps 2 or 3 minutes in total. There were no photographers, no aides taking notes, no careful management of image or message. There were just 2 women, one who had spent decades carrying the weight of royal duty, and one who was still in the middle of learning how to carry it, sharing something honest and warm and entirely human. James stood very still and thought about his mother for reasons he could not entirely explain. He thought about the conversations women have with each other that men rarely get to witness, the kind of conversations that happen in kitchens and quiet hallways and at the edges of events, the ones that hold people together in ways that never make the history books, but matter more than almost anything. He thought about how strange his job was sometimes, how it placed him at the edges of things that were deeply private and required him to carry them without speaking. He carried this one for a long time. He told no one while he was still in service. He spoke about it only later, carefully, to someone he trusted, describing it not as something scandalous or dramatic, because it was neither of those things, but as something quietly extraordinary, something that had shown him, in a way nothing else quite had, that the women who bear the title and the crown and the relentless public attention are beneath all of it, still entirely and recognizably human. The corridor returned to its usual emptiness not long after, and walked on in her direction with that same firm stride. Catherine continued on hers. James remained at his post, as he always did, watching an empty hallway and holding something in his chest that felt surprisingly heavy for a moment that had lasted no longer than a song. But that is the thing about certain moments. They do not need to be long to be lasting. They do not need to be witnessed by thousands to matter. Sometimes a single person, standing quietly in a corridor on a Tuesday afternoon in autumn, sees something that tells him more about the truth of people than any ceremony or celebration ever could. And sometimes years later, that moment still sits in him like a small, warm light, proof that even in the most formal and watched and carefully managed of worlds, there are still moments that belong only to the people living them. And to one very quiet guard, who will never forget what he saw. James did not go home that evening and write anything down. He was not the type. Men who serve in the household division are trained to hold things in a particular way. Not to bury them, exactly, but to place them somewhere inside themselves where they sit without causing trouble. You learn, over years of royal service, that the things you witness are not yours to tell. They belong to the people who live them. You're only ever a bystander, and a bystander keeps his mouth shut. So James locked that Tuesday afternoon in its place and went about his life, and the weeks passed, and the months, and the memory did not fade the way most memories do. If anything, it grew clearer. He noticed, after that day, that he watched Princess indifferently. He had always respected her. Every guard who had served around her did. She was efficient, demanding, unsentimental, and absolutely consistent. She did not waste time. She did not require flattery. She arrived on time, did what was required, and departed without drama. In the world of royal service, where so much depends on smoothness and reliability, these qualities were not small things. They were the foundation of everything, and had built her public life on them over decades. And the results were a record of royal duty that was, by any honest measure, staggering in its scope. But James had always understood her at a slight distance, admired her the way you admire a particularly well-made machine. Functional, impressive, a little cold. What he had seen in the corridor changed that. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that seeing one true thing about a person gradually rewrites everything you thought you knew about them. He began to notice, at subsequent engagements and events, the small ways in which and observe people around her. She was watchful, not in the suspicious or calculating sense, but in the way of someone who has spent a lifetime paying attention to what is real. She noticed when staff were tired. She noticed when something was off in a room. She had the quiet radar of a person who trusts their instincts completely, because their instincts have been refined over 50-plus years of public life. And having seen her turn that radar on Catherine, having seen what it looked like when she used it not for duty but for genuine human care, James understood something about her that he had not understood before. He also noticed Catherine differently. He had been present at dozens of engagements where she moved through rooms with that particular quality. She has warmth that feels personal even when it is directed at strangers, a way of making each individual in a receiving line feel briefly, but sincerely seen. He had always admired this about her. It was, by any measure, a remarkable skill. But watching someone perform well publicly and knowing something about what they carry privately are two very different things. James now carried the knowledge of what she had said in that corridor, the honesty about tiredness, about the fear of falling short, about the weight of always wanting to get things right, and it gave her public grace an entirely new dimension. He understood now that it was not effortless. He had always assumed, on some level, that it was. That some people are simply born with the ability to be warm in the way that Catherine is warm, the way other people are simply born tall or with good hearing. Watching her after that day, he understood that it was not a gift she had been given. It was a thing she worked for. Every single time. There was one engagement, a few weeks after that Tuesday, where James was part of the security detail in a large public hall. Hundreds of people, school children in bright anoraks at the front, local officials, and community leaders arranged in careful rows. Photographers positioned like birds on a wire, lenses pointed. Catherine entered, and the room shifted in that way rooms do when someone significant walks in, a collective turning, a brightening. She worked the room with the precision and the warmth that the public had come to expect from her, and she did it beautifully. James watched from his position near the far wall, and he thought about what she had said. He thought about the tiredness she had described. He thought about the fear of falling short that she carried quietly beneath the smile she gave to every school child who pressed a drawing into her hands. He thought, nobody in this room knows. Nobody here knows what it costs. And he felt, unexpectedly, a deep and genuine admiration that went well beyond the professional respect he had always held for the people he served. That was the thing about James's job that most people did not understand when he tried to explain it. They thought it must be boring, standing still for hours, watching doors, waiting for nothing to happen. They thought the most interesting parts must be the dramatic ones, the security incidents, the moments of genuine threat that the training was designed for. But James had come to believe, after years of service, that the most interesting parts were exactly the opposite. They were the moments of perfect stillness, when the world settled around him and revealed something true. The moment in the corridor had been one of those. He had not been bored that Tuesday afternoon. He had been, in a way he struggled to articulate, profoundly awake. He started to think about what Princess and had actually given Catherine in that exchange. On the surface, it had seemed simple. A few minutes of honest conversation, a bit of unexpected warmth from an older woman to a younger one. But the more James thought about it, the more he realized it was considerably more than that, and had given Catherine something that is genuinely rare in the world of the royal family. She had given her permission. Not official permission, not a formal acknowledgement of anything, but the deeper, more human kind. She had told Catherine, in plain words, that the feeling she carried, the uncertainty, the weight, the fear, were not signs of failure. They were signs of seriousness. She had told her that every woman who had held this kind of responsibility had felt the same things. And in doing so, she had placed Catherine in a line. Not the formal line of succession, not the line of protocol and precedence, but a different and perhaps more important kind, the line of women who had chosen again and again to carry something enormous and to carry it well. That mattered more than it might first appear. Because Catherine's position in the royal family, for all its privilege and visibility, has never been entirely straightforward. She entered a world with its own centuries-old codes and expectations. She was watched from the very beginning with a scrutiny that was both fascinated and sometimes cruel. She was measured against standards that no one had clearly written down, but everyone seemed to know. And through all of it, she had conducted herself with a consistency and a grace that earned her enormous respect. But that respect came from the public, from commentators and observers, for people outside the inner circle looking in. What an offered her in that corridor was different. It was the recognition of someone inside the circle, someone who had been there for decades, someone whose opinion, in that world, carried a particular kind of weight. James thought about the royal family the way most people probably do not think about it, which is to say, as a collection of actual people, each of them trying to navigate something extraordinarily complicated. The ceremony and the tradition and the grandeur are real. The history is real. But underneath all of it, there are human beings getting through their days, having their doubts, finding moments of connection where they can. The corridor moment had shown him this with unusual clarity. He had seen two women set down their public selves for 3 minutes and speak to each other as people. He found himself thinking about this more than he expected. He found himself thinking about the version of the royal family that never appears in photographs. He thought about Anne's youth, which he had read about at various points over the years. She had been, by most accounts, a fierce and determined young woman who pushed back hard against the constraints placed on her. She had been an Olympic athlete, a title that belonged entirely to her own effort and had nothing to do with her birth. She had fought, quietly, persistently, over decades, for the right to be taken seriously on her own terms. She had not always found it easy. There had been difficult periods in her personal life, periods of public criticism, years when the press had not been kind. And she had come through all of it with that characteristic uprightness intact, perhaps because she had never let the opinion of others become the measure by which she judged herself. James thought that this was probably the thing she had most wanted Catherine to understand. Not as advice, not as instruction, just as the testimony of someone who had walked a hard road and come out the other side still standing. There was something else that James returned to again and again in the weeks after the corridor. It was the laugh, the small, genuine, surprised laugh that Catherine had given when and said what she said. He had heard Catherine laugh at public events. Everyone had. It was the kind of laugh that makes people feel included, warm and real, but also perfectly appropriate to the moment. This laugh was different. It was the laugh of someone who had been caught off guard in the best possible way. The laugh of someone who had been seen more clearly than they expected, and found that the experience was a relief rather than a threat. James had heard a lot of different kinds of laughter in his years of service. He could tell the difference between a laugh that was performed and a laugh that was not. This one was not. He thought about the women in his own life when he thought about that laugh. His mother, his older sister, the female colleagues he had served alongside who had, over the years, shown him what it looked like to carry responsibility with both seriousness and humor. He thought about how rarely women get the chance to simply be honest with each other in the way that, and Catherine had been honest in that corridor. How much of women's lives, particularly the lives of women in public roles, is spent managing appearances, softening edges, calibrating the self for different audiences. The corridor had contained almost none of that. It had contained two women speaking plainly to each other, and the result had been something that James, a man who rarely thought about such things, found surprisingly beautiful. He was still thinking about all of this on the afternoon, several months later, when he saw them in the same room at a large formal event. They stood at a considerable distance from each other, separated by the usual logistics of the occasion. Different receiving lines, different groups of guests, different staff attending to different duties. They looked from the outside, exactly as they always looked at such events, composed, gracious, entirely in command of the image they presented. James watched from his post, doing his job, being invisible, and at one point across the crowded, glittering room, he saw Catherine glance in Anne's direction. It was brief, a quick look across the distance and the noise and the ceremony, and without turning her head fully, without breaking her conversation, seemed to notice it. There was the faintest acknowledgement, something in the set of her shoulders, the smallest possible shift that said, "I see you. I know you're there." Nobody else in that room would have noticed. James only noticed because he had been standing in a corridor on a Tuesday afternoon and heard something that he was never supposed to hear. He stood at his post and felt very quietly that he understood something about the institution he served that he had not understood before. Not its history, not its protocol, those things he had always known, but something about its humanity, the invisible threads of recognition and solidarity that ran between the people inside it, beneath all the ceremony, beneath all the distance that the cameras and the crowds and the formal titles created between them. Those threads were real. They were doing real work. And most of the people who watched and read and formed their opinions from the outside would never know they were there. James went home that evening and sat in his kitchen for a long time. He made tea he did not drink. He looked out at the dark garden and thought about what it meant to witness things without being part of them. He thought about what it meant to serve. He thought about how strange it was that a person could stand at the edge of other people's lives for years and years, invisible and present at once, and come away in the end knowing so much and being able to say so little. He thought about the corridor and the light through the windows and the sound of two women laughing together in the middle of an empty afternoon. He thought about how that moment would never be in any book or any archive or any official record of anything. It had existed completely and then it had ended, and the only place it lived now was inside him. That felt, in ways he could not entirely explain, like an enormous privilege. Time does something particular to the memories we carry alone. It does not always soften them. Sometimes it deepens them instead, the way water deepens a color rather than washing it out. James had held the corridor memory for long enough, now, that it had become something different from what it was on the day it happened. On the day it happened, it was simply an unexpected thing he had witnessed, surprising, moving, quickly tucked away. But over the years that followed, as he continued his service and watched both women from the respectful distance of his role, the memory kept finding new meanings. New dimensions revealed themselves, the way a piece of music sounds different the 10th time you hear it than it did the first. He retired from royal service in his late 40s. The leaving was quiet, as everything in that world tends to be, a ceremony modest enough to match the philosophy of the institution, which has always moved forward without looking back, which does not typically make much of departures. He left with the deep satisfaction of a man who has spent his working life doing something he believed in, and with a collection of private memories that belonged entirely to him, untouched by the public record. The corridor was the brightest one. In the years after his retirement, James followed the public lives of both women the way most people follow the royal family. Through news, through the occasional televised event, through the normal channels by which the institution makes itself known to the world outside. And he watched both of them with a layer of understanding that was not available to most viewers. He knew something. Not everything, not anything that would interest a journalist looking for a scandal. There was no scandal in it, not a trace. But he knew something real, and knowing it made the watching different. He saw Catherine face things that no one could fully anticipate or prepare for, things that tested her in ways that went far beyond the ordinary challenges of royal duty. He watched her navigate them with a steadiness that the press sometimes called stoic and sometimes called distant, but which James recognized as something else entirely. He recognized it as the thing she had described that afternoon, the absolute determination not to fall short, even when falling short might have been understandable, even when no one could have blamed her. He saw her honor the responsibility she had taken on again and again in circumstances that were genuinely difficult. And he thought of and saying, "That fear is what keeps you honest." He thought she understood what she was being told. He also watched and, still active, still sharp, still moving through royal duties with that relentless efficiency of hers that seemed to defy both age and the general tendency of human beings to slow down. There was something about watching and in her later years that James found quietly extraordinary. She had become, in some ways, even more fully herself than she had been when he first began serving. The edges had not softened. If anything, they had become more defined. But they were surrounded now by something more complex, something that people who had only ever known her from a distance might not see, but that James, who had seen her in a corridor on a Tuesday afternoon, could recognize clearly. Depth. The kind of depth that takes decades to accumulate and cannot be performed. He thought often about the dynamic between the two of them, about what it said about the royal family as an institution, and as something more personal than that word usually implies. The royal family is many things to many people. To the public, it is a symbol of history, of continuity, of national identity, of tradition. To those who serve within and around it, it is something more complicated, a world with its own internal logic, its own codes of behavior, its own unspoken rules about what matters and what is not. And within that world, as within any world, there are relationships that the formal structure does not capture. There are connections that develop between people not because protocol demands them, but because they are real. What James had witnessed in that corridor was exactly this kind of connection. It was not a formal moment. Nothing was being recorded. No duty was being performed. Two women had stopped, by chance or perhaps not entirely by chance, in the same corridor at the same time, and something true had passed between them. James had spent years thinking about why that particular truth felt so significant, and the answer he kept returning to was this: because it was freely given, because and had not been required to ask how Catherine was feeling, because she had not been required to say what she said in return, because the warmth in that moment did not flow from obligation, but from something older and more genuine than that. It flowed from one woman who had carried hard things for a long time, recognizing another woman who was in the middle of carrying them, and deciding, simply, without ceremony, to let her know she was not alone. That is a small thing. In the context of a family that has produced monarchs and shaped the history of nations, a 3-minute conversation in a corridor is an almost impossibly small thing. James knew this, and yet he also knew, in the way that only the people who have witnessed small things clearly can know, that the small things are often where the truth lives. The grand gestures are visible to everyone. They are documented. They are remembered. But the small gestures, the quiet question, the honest answer, the laugh that comes from being genuinely surprised by kindness, these are the things that actually hold people together. These are the load-bearing moments in the architecture of any relationship, including one between two women who serve the crown. He talked about it, eventually, as has already been mentioned, to someone he trusted in private, with the careful restraint of a man who respects the people he is speaking about and has no interest in reducing them to content. He did not embellish. He did not speculate. He simply described what he had seen and heard as plainly as he could and let it sit. And the person he told responded the way James had always felt in the private place where he kept such thoughts, with quiet recognition. Of course, that person said. Of course that happened. Of course, beneath everything, they are people. And, of course, being people, they find each other in corridors and speak the truth and feel what human beings feel. What else would they do? James thought about the public perception of both women, which he had observed over the years with a particular kind of interest that came from knowing more than the perception contained. Catherine had been, at various points in her public life, described in terms that range from effusive to dismissive, perfect and relatable and wooden and composed and aspirational and remote, sometimes all by the same commentators in the same week, depending on what mood the press had decided to project onto her, and had been described as difficult and admirable and old-fashioned and refreshing and brusque and necessary, a woman whose most famous characteristic was the directness with which she moved through a world that generally preferred its royals to be somewhat more softened at the edges. Neither of these descriptions was entirely wrong, but neither of them captured what James had seen in that corridor, which was that they were first and before anything else real, genuinely, fully, unperformatively real. He thought about realness a lot in his retirement years. He had spent his working life at the edges of a world that is, more than almost any other world, structured around performance, around the careful management of image, around the presentation of a version of self that is simultaneously authentic and symbolic, personal and institutional. The people who inhabit that world are not fake. He had never thought of them as fake, but he had understood for most of his career that they were always, to some degree, performing. That even in the most genuinely felt moments, there was an awareness of being watched, of meaning something to people beyond themselves, of carrying a weight of representation that never fully lifts. The corridor had been different. In the corridor, for those few minutes, there had been no performance at all. Just two women in a hallway being honest about how things felt. It was so ordinary in that sense, and it was, by the measure of the world they lived in, quite extraordinary. There's a version of this story that gets told about the royal family quite often, and it goes something like this. Beneath the ceremony and the tradition, they're just like us. James did not entirely believe this version. They were not just like anyone. Their lives were specific and demanding and shaped by forces that most people never encounter. And it would be a kind of false comfort to sand down the edges of that reality. But there was another version, less popular perhaps because it is more complicated, that James thought was closer to the truth. They are human. That is not the same thing as being just like us. It is simply the recognition that the qualities that define us as human beings, the capacity for honesty, for vulnerability, for connection, for kindness given freely rather than performed, do not stop existing because a person is born into or marries into a family that stand at the center of national life. They persist. They find their way out. They happen in corridors on Tuesday afternoons with no audience, but a guard who stands very still and holds what he has witnessed with something close to reverence. James was in his garden on an ordinary afternoon, pulling weed from a flower bed with a half-focused concentration that gardening tends to produce, when he found himself thinking about both women for no particular reason. There was nothing on the news that day to prompt it. No anniversary, no event. It was just one of those moments where the memory surfaces on its own, unprompted, as the truest memories sometimes do. He sat back on his heels in the dirt and thought about a corridor with high windows and autumn light. He thought about a woman asking a question with genuine care and another woman answering with genuine honesty. He thought about the laugh. He thought about how much had happened since that afternoon, in the world, in the royal family, in his own life, and how none of it had changed what he had seen. He thought about the crown, not as a physical object, though of course there's a physical object. There's several, each carrying their own extraordinary history. But the crown is the thing it represents, the weight of it, the continuity it embodies, the fact that it has been passed from person to person through centuries of history and will go on being passed long after everyone currently alive is gone. There's something almost incomprehensible about this kind of continuity. James had never been much given to grand thoughts about history, but in that moment, kneeling in his garden, he found himself thinking about the chain of it, about all the people who had stood at the center of this institution over all those centuries, each of them carrying the same fundamental weight of responsibility and expectation, each of them finding or not finding the moments of genuine human connection that made the carrying possible. He thought about what and had given Catherine in that corridor as a link in this chain. One woman who had been carrying it for decades, reaching across the distance to tell a younger woman something true and useful, not through formal instruction, not through protocol or tradition, through honesty, through the willingness to say, I have felt what you feel, and it did not break me, and it will not break you. That is the oldest kind of knowledge there is. It passes from person to person, not through documents or ceremonies, but through exactly this kind of moment, quiet, private, witnessed only by those who happen to be standing in the right corridor at the right time. James finished his weeding and went inside and made a cup of tea that he actually drank this time. He sat at his kitchen table and looked out the window at the garden he had tended for years, and he thought about what a strange and full life he had lived, about the things he had seen and held and never spoken about, and the few things he had spoken about quietly to people he trusted. He thought about the corridor one more time, with the clarity and the warmth that the memory had always held for him. He thought, I was lucky to be there. He thought, I was lucky to understand what I was seeing. He thought, not everyone gets to witness something like that, and almost nobody who does gets to understand it as fully as he had understood it in the years since by watching both of them and thinking carefully about what it meant. He thought about Catherine and Princess and each of them somewhere in the world at this moment, each of them continuing to carry the thing they carried, each of them still doing the work. And he thought about a quiet hallway and the kind of moment that does not make history but holds it together from the inside, invisible and essential, the way certain structures are only visible when you know exactly where to look. He finished his tea. He washed up his cup. He went back out into the garden, where the afternoon light was soft and the air was cool, and he returned to the ordinary work of his ordinary day, carrying, as he always had, something quietly extraordinary inside him.